the entire city, bombing it, and then having soldiers go in and telling them that every single living person in Fallujah should be shot, and they were. But as a result of these high-tech weapons used on Fallujah and the rest of the country, but in Fallujah alone, scientists say that the fallout from depleted uranium causing these birth defects and infant mortality and cancer is worse than the fallout in Hiroshima. Now, Hiroshima has the worst fallout on the planet. So when you say something has a worse fallout than Hiroshima, you're saying that it's the worst fallout in history. So that's what the people of Fallujah now live with. And this is all not to mention the grinding poverty, rampant unemployment, food insecurity, lack of medical supplies, of course, replacing a once reputable healthcare system where every single person had access to free healthcare. This is not something they told us when we were invading Iraq. Of course, also education was completely free through college, where even people in the most remote villages had access to a doctor, access to an education. And in a country of nearly 30 million people, 1 in 3 Iraqis is either dead, wounded, or a refugee. And every single day that the occupation continues produces more dead, more wounded, and more displaced. So, where are we today in terms of the war? Well, you know, there was such popular opposition to the war in Iraq. You know, when the war was starting, there were the largest anti-war demonstrations in history. Never before in the history of the world had so many people poured out onto the streets to prevent the war from happening. It was a landmark event in human history. And actually, the New York Times in 2003 wrote an editorial and said, there's a new superpower in the world, and that superpower is the US anti-war movement. I mean, this is how much opposition there was. And that opposition swelled, so much so that the hoping to be incoming Democratic Party in the last election, every single politician hoping to be elected had to give lip service to the anti-war movement. The Democratic candidate for president that was selected was the one who had the strongest opposition to the Iraq War, or seemingly strongest, promising a withdrawal by the end of 2011, actually this year. So by the end of December, we should have all troops out of Iraq, right? And that's what we were told. And because of this popular opposition, every single Democrat wanting to get elected had to say, we are on board with withdrawing all troops from Iraq. The president had to say the same thing, and once in office had to say, this is the plan, we're going to stay there for this amount of time. At the end of 2011, we're all going to be out. Well, first off, the end of combat operations that were declared nearly a year ago. They declared the end of combat, but somehow Iraqis kept being shot by US soldiers. Somehow US soldiers kept being killed in combat. So the end of combat really didn't mean much because there were still deaths happening on both sides. And actually, on April 9th, 2 more US soldiers were killed. And that same day, Robert Gates, the Secretary of Defense, was in Iraq visiting. And he said that the Pentagon was considering not withdrawing at the end of 2011. That they are considering, quote, from staying an extra couple of years to remaining in Iraq as permanent partners. So, this doesn't seem like a full withdrawal by the end of 2011. And And in fact, these were indications that were given prior to these statements made by Gates. You know, there were always intended these massive U.S. bases in Iraq as permanent structures, at least 5 heavily fortified compounds guarded by U.S. troops. There's still about 50,000 U.S. troops in Iraq right now. We're all due to leave. The drawdown that already happened, soldiers were simply replaced with mercenaries. You know, these much-hated Blackwater mercenaries that the Iraqi people have long been trying to kick out of their country, one that even the Iraqi government, you know, this comprador Iraqi government took up as a demand and tried to expel Blackwater from the country. And the U.S. said, no, you can't kick them out, they're going to stay here. This is a democracy for the Iraqi people, where ultimately it's the United States that makes the final decision. You know, this was the Bush plan from the beginning. The Bush administration never intended on having massive numbers of soldiers there. They thought it would be easy. They'd just set up a government, a few bases, and they could leave. But toppling the Iraqi government, replacing it with a new government completely propped up by Washington that was friendly to U.S. business and military interests, with few soldiers remaining to guard those interests, this was always the plan. And, you know, Robert Gates, when he made that announcement that the U.S. is likely to stay in Iraq permanently, he went so far as to make the very ridiculous assertion that the Pentagon would base its decisions on, we said, what the Iraqi people want. Now, the Iraqi people responded the very next day by taking to the streets in the tens of thousands, burning effigies of U.S. soldiers, and saying that if the U.S. troops stay in Iraq one day past that deadline, that they would return to armed struggle, those that had laid down their arms. The leader, Sadr, who commanded the Mahdi army, said that if the United States stays one day past this deadline, we will reform this militia, reform armed struggle. Not just armed struggle, but a two-front approach of both armed resistance and civil, peaceful resistance through sit-ins and demonstrations. And so the Iraqis that Gates was referring to was not the Iraqi people, but, you know, the wealthy Iraqi politicians who are enjoying their new power, who exist only because of the backing of Washington. Now, the Iraqi government, as we've seen recently, you know, when the wave of Arab revolts spread to Iraq also, like they did throughout the Arab world, and people demonstrated in the thousands against what they see rightfully as a corrupt government, that they were shot and killed as they were demonstrating. Over 40 people that we know of were killed in peaceful protest. That journalists who attended the event were arrested and tortured. We know that this new Iraqi government has carried out extrajudicial killings, that torture is continuing in their torture cells, that rival political groups are shut down and smashed and their leaders arrested. Those who organized the protests, the leaders were all arrested, their offices were shut down, and they're being tortured in prison right now. Now, aren't these the things that the U.S. government told us were the reasons that we had to overthrow Saddam Hussein? That we could not allow the government to treat its people this way? No, the Iraqi people will never accept foreign occupation, especially one that has subjected them to such a horror for the past 20 years, one that in the past 8 years slaughtered 1 million people, leveled their cities. So that lull in the violence that we've seen for about the past year and a half was just temporary. And so a return to the bloodbath that we saw between 2003 and 2008 is right around the corner. Because the United States does not intend to leave. They want to stay permanently. This was their plan from the beginning. This is their plan today. But of course, this is of little concern to Gates and the Pentagon. They already sent over 5,000 of us to our deaths. They already killed over 1 million people. They don't care how many people die or come home in wheelchairs. They only calculate what level of death and destruction they can get away with to achieve their imperial aims. Meaning, what the American people will accept and allow them to do before they're breaking through the barricades of the White House. So, that's Iraq today, this very significant recent revelation where the Pentagon is beginning to prepare the people of the United States for a permanent occupation, one that will continue to take the lives of U.S. soldiers, one that will continue to make life miserable for the people of Iraq. Now, this is just one of the endless wars and permanent occupations that the United States is engaged in right now. Now, while Iraq has taken a lull in the violence, not really for the Iraqi people, but for U.S. troops, for casualties that dropped, all those troops that were sent home from Iraq in this drawdown were sent straight to Afghanistan, where there's a nearly decade-long war that's been raging, where 2010 doubled the fatalities for U.S. troops of 2009 nearly doubling that of 2008, this year being the deadliest for both U.S. troops and Afghan civilians. Let's take a step back again like we did with Iraq and see how the United States got to this situation and the strategy that they pursued in Afghanistan. Now, what's the main reason we're now told that we must be in Afghanistan? Right? We were told initially it was to catch bin Laden, even though the Taliban offered to extradite bin Laden on 9/11, said, you can have him, know where he is, come get him. And Bush said, no negotiations with terrorists, and began bombing the country. What we're told now, when President Obama announced the troop surge in Afghanistan last year, he said, we must drive the Taliban from any chance at political power. Because if they hold any political power, Afghanistan will be able to be a hotbed of terrorist activity, that they would not allow the Taliban to implement these human rights violations, this repression on women. They're so concerned, seemingly, with the Afghan people. Now, if you know the history of Afghanistan, you know that the United States has actually had a pretty long-standing friendly relationship with the Taliban and with the organization that preceded it, the Mujahideen, where they were funded and trained by the United States. The United States says it cares so much about the repression and the political ideology of the Taliban, but they didn't really care so much about that when they were sending envoys to Afghanistan to meet with Taliban leaders to discuss all of the great lucrative business opportunities in Afghanistan. The construction of pipelines, the mining for minerals, the conquering of its financial sector,